Hey guys, my name is Ankur, and in this series of videos, I'm going to talk about CSS Grid layouts and CSS Flexbox layouts. Flexbox Layout has been in all major browsers except IE for a couple of years now, and CSS Grid layouts are going to soon ship in Firefox and Chrome, and IE and Safari as well by the middle of next year. Both these layout systems make complex layouts on the web super simple. So in this series of videos, we are going to look at 3 separate layouts, and we're going to build them both with Flexbox as well as Grid. And this will let you evaluate which layout system is better for which situation and how to tackle different layout situations in your own web projects. So in this series of tutorials, we're going to look at 3 different layouts. One layout is a portfolio website layout. And as you can see, on the left side, there is a sidebar, a fixed sidebar with a bunch of text. On the right side of the screen, you can see some content. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that there's a grid of services offered by this specific consultancy. If you resize the screen and look at it on a smaller screen, all the content collapses and appears linearly, one after the other. The second layout we're going to look at is a news website layout. And this is a typical news website layout. You've got a header. You've got a sidebar with news in brief, and a bunch of small cards below that containing the weather, sports information, and what have you. The main content area consists of a bunch of cards of varying sizes. For example, the cover story spans the entire width of the screen, and there are smaller stories below that, each of which is 50% of the screen. And even smaller stories before that, each of which is 33% of the screen. And at the very bottom of the page, you can see that there are 3 columns with a bunch of links to other sections of the newspaper. If we resize this layout, this once again becomes a linear layout where all the cards and all the stories appear one after the other. So all the main stories appear first, all the main story cards, followed by all the news and briefs. And that is then followed by the weather. And at the end of the page, you can see all the links linking to different sections of the newspaper. The third layout that we're going to cover is an application layout. And this application is similar to WhatsApp or Telegram. It's a chat application. And here on the left side of the screen, you can see a list of contacts. And on the right side of the screen, you can see the actual conversation happening. And the conversation has timestamps and avatars and usernames and everything. When we resize this, everything collapses once again into a linear layout, and all you can see is a list of contacts. If this was an actual application and we had some JavaScript, clicking each one of these links would actually open the conversation. Before we go on to building these layouts, let's do a bit of setup. So to begin with, the web browser I'm using for all these demonstrations is Google Chrome Canary. This is currently your best bet for getting full support for the grid layout. For Flexbox, you can use any version of Chrome or Firefox that is available on your computer. And for grid layout, before we can use grid layout in a project, we'll have to enable it using Chrome flags. And in the list of flags, look for Enable Experimental Web Platform Features. And just click the Enable button and restart your browser. This will enable grid layout in your browser. Soon, the grid layout will be available by default in the regular version of Chrome as well. But for now, this is how we have to use it. I'm going to use a small Node.js application called HTTP Server to serve all my static files. To install it, you can type npm install -g HTTP Server, and this will pull it down. I already have it installed on my computer, so I'm not going to download it again. And let's start by creating a bunch of directories for our code. I'm going to call it layout. And inside of layout, I'm going to create one directory for each of the 3 layouts that we're going to tackle. So the first one is portfolio. Second one is news. The third one is app. I use WebStorm as my IDE. I'm going to use WebStorm to create some initial files. So let's begin with the portfolio layout. The first thing I'm going to do is create a base CSS file which will contain all the constants required by both the grid as well as the Flexbox layouts for the portfolio layout. Let's call it pf-base. I'm going to create a directory for holding the Flexbox layout, another one for holding the grid layout. Let's start by building the Flexbox layout. Let's title this page Portfolio and add one more CSS file called pf-flex.css. This will hold all the Flexbox specific code for our project. So now this is what our directory structure looks like. We have our layout directory, and within that we have one directory each for all the layouts we're going to tackle. And we are currently working on the portfolio layout, and we are starting by building the Flexbox version of the portfolio layout. I'm going to keep the existing version of the layout open in one tab just for reference, so we can look at it when we need to. And let's begin by building the mobile version, and then scale up to the desktop version. All right, so let's start by adding the meta viewport tag. Device equals width equals device width, and initial scale equals 1. Now let's take a look back to our reference layout. I'm going to divide the page into two parts. The first part is going to be the sidebar, which in this case appears at the top of the layout. And the second part is going to be the content, which appears after the sidebar. So I'm going to create a div and call it pf content, which is going to be the content wrapper for all of our code. I'm going to create a div inside of that and call it pf sidebar, and another one called pf content. Within the sidebar, I'm going to add a header, and I'm going to say, hi there, followed by a paragraph of any text you please. Inside of the content block, I'm going to add a paragraph, followed by another div, which I'm going to call pf grid. And this is going to represent our grid of services, a grid of consulting, training, and speaking services that appears at the bottom of the page. I'm also going to add another heading call it services. And within my grid, I'm going to add a bunch of grid items. I'm going to call it pf grid item. And I'm going to add, say, 6 of them. Each grid item will have a heading, a paragraph of text explaining what it is, and a link pointing to a Learn More page. This is what a DOM structure looks like. I'm going to quickly fill up this content with some dummy text so we can continue with the tutorial. Inside of my content area, I'm going to have a paragraph of text, which is what you see here at the top of the page. Following that, I'm going to have a heading. I'm going to call it services. Following that, I'm going to have another div, and this one I'm going to call pf grid. This represents the colored grid of services we have at the bottom here. And inside of this grid, I'm going to add a bunch of pf grid items. And let's say I want to add 6 of them. Each pf grid item itself contains a heading, a bit of text explaining the service, and finally a link pointing to a Learn More page. So this is what a DOM structure looks like. Let me fill it out with some dummy text, and we can continue with the tutorial. All right, so now I've filled out the content on this particular page. Let's walk through the DOM structure quickly again. The outer container is called pf container. It's a wrapper for all the DOM elements in the rest of the page. Inside of pf container, you have a pf sidebar that contains a little bit of text and a paragraph with some description. Following the sidebar, you've got another section, another div called pf content, which contains a paragraph, followed by a heading called services, followed by another div called pf grid that contains a bunch of pf grid items, each item describing one specific service provided by this hypothetical consulting agency. And we haven't added any styles yet. So let's quickly go to the browser and take a look at what our page looks like. So this is what the page looks like. Pretty plain. You can see the sidebar appears at the top, followed by the paragraph, the content, and which is then followed by all the pf grid items, everything completely unstyled. We're going to begin by adding a little bit of common code that's required between both the Flexbox and the grid implementation. So let's go to pfbase.css. Let's begin by declaring our box sizing rules. In case you're not familiar with these box sizing rules, there's a link to a tutorial in the description box below. So we declare box sizing on the HTML element as border box, and then every single element on the page and every single pseudo element on the page takes a box sizing inherit rule. On the body, we're going to declare a minimum font size. We'll call it 16 pixels. A line height of 1.5, and font family of sans serif. We want to give our sidebar a bit of a background color. So let's say pf sidebar, background color gray. And let's pull this style sheet into our page. Right. Now let's give our grid items down here some background color as well. Let's make our links a little prettier. And that's it. So now let's give the sidebar as well as all the grid items a little bit of padding. For the sidebar padding, I'm using a unit called viewport unit. So as you can see on line 25, the padding is specified as 5 VW. VW stands for viewport width. A single viewport unit, for example, 1 VW, equals 1% of the width of your viewport. So for example, if your viewport is 100 pixels wide, 1 VW equals a single pixel. If your viewport is 1,000 pixels wide, 1 VW will be 10 pixels. This lets you specify very fluid units, especially for things like padding and spacing and typography. So a sidebar has a padding of 5 VW, and as you increase or decrease the size of the viewport, this padding is going to increase or decrease proportionally. For the grid item, we're going to use 3 VW of padding. Let's see how that looks. Now that we've got some of our base CSS set up, we can start writing Flexbox specific CSS. So let's go to pfflex.css and start by styling the outer container, pf container. To enable Flexbox layout on a container, all you have to do is say display flex. Now because we have 2 different layouts for 2 different screen sizes, we're going to create a media query. And my min width, my max width is going to be 900 pixels. So this is going to contain code for small screens. In a real-world project, you're likely to have a bunch of breakpoints for a lot of different screen sizes and devices, but for this tutorial, we're just going to use 2 media queries, one for small screens and one for large screens, broken at 900 pixels. Now that we have our PF container with display flex, we need to define a direction in which the flex items are arranged. And to do that, we're going to say flex direction column. Flexbox arranges items linearly along a linear axis. The default behavior for Flexbox is to arrange all the items horizontally in a horizontal axis. But because our mobile layout is a vertical layout with items appearing one after another, we need to arrange them from top to bottom, which is why a flex direction in this case becomes column. Let's take a look. Nothing changes. Now we need to define some margin between our PF grid items. And I'm going to call it 1 rem. And then I'm going to pull this style sheet into our page and refresh. And we have this layout. Remove the bottom margin from the final child. Now let's center the text in the sidebar or the header, both vertically as well as horizontally. To center the text vertically, we're going to use the justify content property and say justify content center. And because the sidebar is not long enough, you don't get to see it, but the text is justified vertically in the center. To look at it, let's increase the height of the sidebar for a second. As you can see, the text appears in the center. Now to center the content on the horizontal axis, we can use the align items property. Refresh the page, and there it is. Everything is in the center. But if you decrease the screen size further, the text aligns towards the left. So let's use the text align property as well to center wrapped text also. So now our text is aligned in the center both horizontally as well as vertically. If you've written any CSS code, you'll know how hard this is to do. But Flexbox makes it easy as pie. Next thing, I'm going to remove the padding margin on the body real quick. Yeah. And add some padding to the content itself. And there you have it. Our mobile layout is done. Now let's start building the desktop layout. Let's make a browser window larger. And you can see that the sidebar is already on the left because we specified that the PF container is a Flexbox container. And the default value for the flex direction is row. So our browser has attempted to lay out our sidebar and our main content side by side in a row. This is exactly what we want, but we need to play with the sizes a little bit. So let's create a media query for the desktop. And we'll break at 901 pixels. Our sidebar is going to have a flex property of 35 VW, and our content container is going to have a flex property of 65 VW. Let's see what this does before we figure out what it means. So what we've done here using the flex property is redistributed the space on the page in a way that the sidebar occupies 35% of the view width and the content occupies 65% of the view width. So the sidebar is now 35% of the view width and the content is about 65%. Now let's get to work on the Flexbox grid, the the services grid. And in the services grid, we want to display the entire grid as a Flexbox container, because Flexbox can nest. We can have as many Flexbox containers nested within each other as we want. We will keep our default flex direction of row, but we're going to set flex wrap to wrap. By default, Flexbox is trying to cram all the items, all the Flexbox items into one row, but we don't want that. We want the items, if there's no space left for a new item, we want that item to appear in a new line. So we can say flex wrap to accomplish that. So let's see what it looks like. All right. For each grid item, we need to declare a width. And we're going to say 48%. Now this is already starting to look like a grid. We also want each grid item to have a right margin of about 1 rem. Let's bump this down to 47%, and there we have it. We have our services grid. So in about 52 lines of code, we've almost accomplished our layout. The one thing that's still left to do is make the sidebar a fixed sidebar. So let's go to our sidebar and say position fixed. Let's see what happens. This breaks our entire layout, because when we define an item, when we define the position of an item as fixed, it is taken out of the regular flow of the document. So as you can see, the sidebar has now been taken out of the regular flow of the document, and the content area is occupying 100% of the screen width right now. Let's fix this. Let's try to fix this. To begin with, we need to give our sidebar a height, and we'll say 100% of the view height. We also need to give it a width, because it's no longer in the Flexbox. Our flex property of 35 VW doesn't apply anymore. So I'm going to say width 35 VW. And our dimensions are correct, but our sidebar is still overlapping with our content, which needs to be pushed to the right. So let's wrap our sidebar in a container. Let's call it PF sidebar container. And what we're going to do is have the PF sidebar container occupy 35% of the view width, so it can push the remaining content over to the right side. And there you have it. Now our sidebar is fixed. We have our grid, and our content is occupying the correct space. Let's see what happens when we resize the browser. After we hit 900 pixels, everything becomes a linear layout from top to bottom. And if we increase the width, we get a fixed sidebar. So that was how to build a portfolio layout using Flexbox in about 50 lines of code, 58 lines of code. And this is how to build a portfolio layout using Flexbox in less than 60 lines of code. Next, we'll move on and build the same layout using CSS grids. For the grid layout, we're going to reuse much of the markup that we use for the Flexbox layout. And we're also going to reuse our CSS file pfbase.css, which contains some base styling for the page. So let's create our HTML file, and we're just going to copy over the markup from the Flexbox bit to our grid file. And I'm also going to create a new CSS file called pfgrid.css. Let's fix the markup a little bit. We need to refer to the correct CSS file in our head section. And we can get rid of this sidebar container because that was a sort of a dirty hack we used just to get our Flexbox behaving correctly. Now let's go to the browser and see what this looks like. Pretty much no styling. So let's begin once again with the mobile layout. And let's go to pfgrid.css. To declare a DOM container as a grid container, all you have to do is say pf container display grid. And let's see what this does. Nothing much. Everything still looks the same. Let's start by writing a media query for smaller screens. Max width is 900 pixels. And now let's begin by styling the sidebar. Now to style the sidebar, once again, we can declare it as display grid. And in the same way that we used align items and justify content in the Flexbox version of the code, we can use justify items and align items in the grid version of the code and have everything work as expected. And we're also going to add text align center to get the text to behave properly. Next, let's add some padding to the content. There we go. And now let's style our grid, our services grid. Once again, we're going to say display grid. Let's declare the number of rows and columns in our PF grid using the grid template columns and grid template rows properties. So when we say grid template rows auto, we're telling the browser, hey, just figure out how many rows we need for these many elements. And in this case, because we've declared only a single column, the number of rows is going to be equal to the number of elements that are the children of the grid container. So if we have 20 grid items, we're going to have 20 grid rows. And if we have a single grid item, we're going to have a single row. The grid template columns property is declared as 1FR. And the FR is a fractional unit which tells the grid layout to figure out how to distribute space to a number of elements within a given grid column or a given grid row. So for example, if my grid template columns property was to read 1FR, 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 we would have 3 columns occupying 33% of the space each. If it was 1FR and 1FR, we would have 2 columns occupying 50% of the space each. So this behaves similar to the flex property in Flexbox. Since we only need a single column and we want all the space to be occupied by that single column, we are just going to use 1FR for the grid template columns property. Refreshing the page, we've got our grid. But there's no gutters between the grid items. So Let's use the grid gap property to add, in fact, let's use the grid row gap property to add 1 rem of space between each grid item. And there we go. Our grid is ready. Now let's build the same layout. Let's just scale the same layout to the desktop. Maximizing a browser. Very few styles applied. Let's write a media query for this. Min width of 901 pixels. And in our PF container, let's define 2 columns. One column that occupies 1 FR and another column says 2 FR. So we have 2 columns, one of which occupies 33% of the space on the page, and the second column occupies 66% of the space on the page. And we just used auto for the template rows property. Let's see what happened. Our sidebar is already on the side, and our content is on the right because the grid layout has automatically chosen the best possible placement for our given DOM elements. Before we fix the sidebar, let's build the grid. I'm going to use display grid for the grid, and we're going to declare 2 columns of 1 FR each and an infinite number of rows. Let's see what this looks like. We have a grid, but there's no gap again. So let's add a gutter to this. We can simply use grid gap 1 rem. And we have our services grid. Now let's fix the sidebar. Let's see what happens now. Once again, because the sidebar is fixed, it's been taken out of the flow of the document, and the services section, the content section, has now been moved into the first grid column, which makes the page look like this. So let's fix this. To begin with, let's increase the height of our sidebar. And set the width to about 33%. And then for PF content, we can explicitly specify which row and which column to place the content element in. So we use the grid column start property to place it in the second column of our defined grid, which places it on the right side of the screen. And there you go. We've got a portfolio layout with a fixed sidebar using the grid layout. And if we resize the browser, it behaves correctly depending on what breakpoints we're hitting. So small screen and large screen. And it only took us about less than 50 lines of code. So that's how to build a portfolio layout using the Flexbox layout system as well as the grid layout system.